In the stillness, frozen in another century, far from the tumult of our time, there existed a world where time flowed more slowly, like tea leaves slowly infusing in a silver teapot. Dear spectators, you are about to dive into this world. A world of humming samovars and whispering cups, a world of snow-covered estates, velvet gloves, and flickering candles. Here, everything is soft. You are safe. All you need to do is listen and let your mind drift to sleep. Take a deep breath. Let your shoulders relax. Close your eyes gently if you haven't already. And now, follow me into the plush salons of the Russian aristocracy, somewhere in the mid-19th century. In the vast homes of 19th century Russian aristocrats, there was always an invisible center, a point of balance around which life seemed to reorganize. It was neither the master's office, nor the ballroom where endless waltzes echoed, nor even the private chapel where prayers were whispered at dawn. No, the true beating heart was where the samovar had been lit. The samovar was not merely a metal machine, polished until it shone like a mirror. It was almost a living being. It was said to breathe. The soft breath of its steam, the gentle murmur of the simmering water, all formed a kind of discreet song that filled the room with an intimate warmth. In the immense salons, with heavy velvet curtains and waxed floors where footsteps echoed, it became a familiar presence, a silent companion. Around it, everything was organized. Conversations softened, gestures slowed down. One did not drink tea like one would drink a glass of water, quickly and distractedly, without paying attention. No, people gathered, waiting for the water to bubble, watching the steam rise like a light offering. Time lengthened, and in this slowdown, something essential appeared, a shared intimacy. In the Volkonsky house, for example, the samovar stood proudly at the center of the salon, placed on a white tablecloth embroidered with gold thread. It was made of red copper, engraved with floral patterns that seemed to dance in the light of the candles. Every winter evening, the servants would fill it with water, place glowing charcoal inside, and wait for the magic to begin. The children, sitting by the fire, eagerly awaited the moment when the first bubbles would burst, signaling the time for tea. The father, still in his military uniform, would place his saber at the entrance and join the circle. The mother, draped in a dark silk gown, would sit by the table and prepare the crystal glasses. One had to see those glasses, cut from the purest crystal, capturing the light like drops of frost. Strong black tea, almost thick, was poured into them, followed by a wedge of lemon or a spoonful of currant jam. Sometimes, a sugar cube would be dipped between the teeth, and the tea would be passed over it, according to a typically Russian custom that turned each sip into a sweet caress. Everything in this ritual had its own slowness. Nothing was done hastily. Pouring the tea was a ceremonial act, almost religious. One would lift the small teapot placed on the samovar, the zavarka, a dark and fragrant concentrate, and then dilute it in the hot water. Every gesture was measured, each drop counted. And it wasn't just the tea being prepared this way. It was also the words that would be exchanged. For around the samovar, people spoke differently. Arguments seemed suspended, grudges softened. It was the place for confessions, muffled laughter, and sometimes even knowing silences. A simple glass of tea could convey everything. Offered without sugar, it signified rigor, too sweet. It could be a sign of hidden affection. Thus, young aristocrats sometimes saw it as a discreet ground for seduction. A story still circulates about a certain Countess Kurakina, who, during a particularly harsh winter, supposedly confessed her inclination to an officer by pouring her tea in a singular way. 3 spoonfuls of sugar, such an excess that no one could ignore it. The officer, it is said, understood the message and stayed longer than expected that evening, prolonging the conversation until the last ember of the samovar. But the samovar was not just the accomplice of blossoming love. It was also the refuge of solitude. Many aristocrats, after a noisy social evening, would retreat into the silence of their study with a simple glass of burning tea. There, they would let the warmth fill their chest, watch the steam rise, and find in this gesture a kind of reconciliation with themselves. There was something hypnotic in the way the steam rose, blending with the flickering light of the candles. Many said that one could read their thoughts in it, just as one would read clouds in the sky. Some Russian poets even made it a symbol of the soul, elusive, fleeting, but with a poignant beauty. And then, there were the sounds. The light crackle of the charcoal, the gentle tremble of the water, the clinking of spoons against crystal, a discreet, familiar music that accompanied winter evenings like a lullaby. These sounds, repeated every evening, eventually anchored themselves in the memories of children who, decades later, could still hear them when they closed their eyes. Thus, the samovar became more than an object. It was a point of memory. Every family had one, sometimes passed down from generation to generation. Some were so old that they still bore the marks of journeys across the steppes, dented by the jolts, blackened by the fire of campfires. Others, on the contrary, shone like jewels, adorned with silver or enamel, given during weddings or births. In all cases, it remained at the center, still and reassuring, like a star in the Russian winter. And around it, life took on a particular rhythm, slower, softer, as if the outside world, its storms, intrigues, wars remained, for a moment, kept at a distance. The samovar, they said, was not just the beating heart of the house. It was its breath, its soul, and sometimes even its secret. When the first crates of tea finally crossed the borders of the empire, it was not merely a commodity entering Russia, but a fragment from afar, a promise of exoticism and refinement. Each bale represented thousands of kilometers traveled, weeks of cold and storms endured, negotiations held at the price of silence and gold. But all of this faded the moment the caravan finally reached Russian soil. The tea then appeared as a revelation, an invisible but brilliant conquest. One winter morning, while the Moskva River was still frozen, a rumor spread through the city. The great caravan had finally arrived. It had been awaited for weeks. The church bells rang, not for a religious feast, but because the news spread from mouth to mouth, from the poor districts to the palaces of the nobility. The inhabitants crowded the snowy streets, gathering on the outskirts. Children, their cheeks red from the cold, ran ahead of the sledges, fascinated by these figures from afar. The caravan entered slowly, covered in frost, escorted by merchants with weathered faces from the wind and sun of the steppes. Their fur coats still bore traces of the journey. Dust, hardened snow, cracked leather. On the carts, crates of tea were piled high, pressed tightly together, sealed with wax and marked with mysterious Chinese inscriptions. Through the gaps in the wood, sometimes a faint fragrance would escape, a dry, herbal scent that contrasted with the icy air of Moscow. It looked like a royal procession. The merchants, proud despite their exhaustion, held their heads high. They knew what they were bringing, a treasure more precious than gold. In the streets, wealthy Moscow merchants were already waiting, ready to negotiate the first batches. The prices would soar. One single bale could be worth the dowry of a young girl. The nobles, on the other hand, watched from their richly decorated sledges. They did not descend into the crowd. They sent their stewards, but in their eyes, there was impatience. For each one wanted to be among the first to serve this tea from the east, a glowing symbol of refinement and social power. A chronicler of the time recounts that, on that day, the streets of Moscow smelled of tea long before it was tasted, as if the entire city had breathed in a new breath. And that very evening, in the salons of the most influential families, the samovars were already singing. Conversations resumed around steaming glasses, and people congratulated themselves for having, in one way or another, taken part in this invisible celebration, the arrival of tea. A few days later, in a palace in St. Petersburg, a countess awaited with feverish impatience. Her servants had finally brought a small crate of tea, bought at an exorbitant price. It was brought into her rooms as if it were a precious jewel. The crate, sealed with foreign characters that none of the servants could read, seemed to almost vibrate with a distant mystery. The Countess, gloved in lace, touched the wood as if to already feel through it the promise of a journey. She had the crate opened with calculated slowness. The scent escaped immediately, subtle, barely perceptible, but enough to fill the air with a delicate strangeness. A polished silver samovar was brought in, heated with care. The water began to hum softly, and the steam rose like sacred smoke. When she finally dipped a pinch of leaves into the boiling water, she watched, fascinated, their slow dance, as if these fragments of the East were coming to life in her salon. When she brought the first sip to her lips, she closed her eyes. The taste, both bitter and smooth, surprised her. She had never drunk anything like it. It was neither wine nor broth, nor an ordinary infusion. It was something else, a drink that belonged to no known world. In the silence of her velvet-draped room, the Countess understood that she was holding a symbol, a sign of distinction, a doorway to a refinement reserved for those who could afford it. Tea would not only be a beverage, but an invisible border between the privileged and the others. That very evening, she sent out invitations for a select circle of friends. She wanted to be the first, in her circle, to reveal this novelty. And already, as she raised her cup, she imagined the envious glances that would follow this simple gesture, but one filled with a new power. Long before tea became a symbol of Russian salons or singing samovars, it arrived as an exotic messenger, offered to Tsar Michael I by Mongol ambassadors in the 17th century. These first bales, small and wrapped in paper or wax, were met with curiosity mixed with suspicion. In the halls of the Kremlin, courtiers hesitantly tasted this liquid with unfamiliar scents, oscillating between fascination and caution. Some could not understand how such an alien beverage could charm palates accustomed to European wines and liqueurs. Others, bolder, saw tea as a precious treasure, a symbol of refinement and an opening to distant worlds. The real boom of tea in Russia was closely linked to the Treaty of Nerchinsk, signed in 1689. This treaty, which established the borders between China and Siberia, opened new trade routes and gave rise to the legendary Siberian route. Caravans carrying bales of tea and other goods crossed thousands of kilometers, navigating steep passes, frozen rivers, and stony deserts. Each delivery was awaited as an event, and every bale arriving in Irkutsk or Tobolsk was celebrated by the merchants and local elites. The rarity and exotic nature of tea made it an object of fascination and desire. In St. Petersburg and Moscow, samovars appeared in wealthy households in the 18th century, quickly becoming a symbol of prestige. Writers and chroniclers of the time marveled at these new habits, the scent of tea floating through the apartments, the lively debates around its preparation, and innovations in porcelain and silverware. Tea was no longer just a foreign curiosity. It embodied refinement and modernity, and every cup served became a small social ritual, revealing status and culture. But the path to the democratization of tea was long. In the countryside and small towns, this beverage remained rare and expensive. It was only by the end of the 18th century that consumption began to spread, fueled by the growth of domestic trade and the rise of Moscow and St. Petersburg merchants. Cafes and public salons, inspired by European traditions, offered tea as a daily drink, and soon, customs multiplied. From social breaks to family rituals, tea became a central part of Russian life. The 19th century brought new innovations. Botanists and adventurers attempted to domesticate the tea plant in the southern regions of the empire, as well as in greenhouses in St. Petersburg, to protect it from the harsh winters. These experiments gradually transformed the imported tea into a cultivable plant on Russian soil. Letters from diplomats and scientists testify to these fascinating trials. Each acclimated shoot represented a small miracle and sparked admiration among the elites. The beverage, once a symbol of exoticism, was now taking root in Russian culture, blending curiosity, science, and social prestige. At this time, historical figures played an active role in spreading tea. Merchants like Nikolai Shustov and Sava Mamontov made their mark in the tea trade, accumulating fortunes and influence, while literary salons in Moscow and St. Petersburg served tea as a central element in their intellectual gatherings. Tea appeared in the novels of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, where its social virtues and refined rituals were described. From political debates over porcelain sets to philosophical discussions in cozy apartments, the 20th century was paradoxical. Despite widespread consumption, tea supply often remained unstable. Government campaigns aimed at reducing alcoholism encouraged the consumption of tea in factories, at work, and in the military. The drink then became both a cultural symbol and a tool of social policy. Samovars continued to sing in homes and public places, while exotic leaves, once considered a luxury, became part of the daily routine, making tea both an ordinary and precious experience. Thus, over the centuries, tea in Russia went from diplomatic curiosity to national beverage. It became a social marker, a symbol of refinement, an object of science and prestige, and eventually a daily tradition for millions of Russians. Each cup told a story of distant travels, botanical experiments, social innovations, and cultural fascination. Tea was no longer just a drink. It had become a bridge between the East and Russia, between the past and the present, between luxury and everyday life. Thus ends this journey into the heart of modern cafes and salons, where tea is no longer just a beverage but an art, a ritual, a bridge between the past and the present. If you enjoyed this dive into the fascinating world of Russian tea, feel free to share your thoughts, explore your own moments of tasting, and savor each cup as an invitation to travel and wonder